I'm Avery Lane, 31 years old, and the morning we lowered my grandfather into the ground smelled like wet stone and lilies. Boston's sky pressed low, while a line of umbrellas bowed toward the open grave, and somewhere beyond the cemetery gates, my so-called family was already talking business. Inside the chapel afterward, the air still tasted of incense, when the attorney cleared his throat and said there was no will, and Gerald, the man who raised me, looked at me with a small, polished smile that didn't belong at a funeral. He leaned close as if sharing a kindness and told me I wouldn't see a penny that Caleb would carry the name forward, and the words landed with a calm so practiced they hurt more than if he'd shouted. I kept my hands folded in my lap and watched the stained glass throw colors across the floor, red and gold and blue, like pieces of a story that no longer fit together. By the time we stepped back into the rain, grief had been tidied away like a program left on a pew, and the part of me that had believed hard work and fairness were enough felt suddenly dangerously naive. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And if you've ever had to stand your ground when someone tried to erase you, tap like and subscribe so this story reaches someone who needs it. I grew up in modest rooms that smelled of coffee and Murphy's oil soap, a second-floor walk-up over a barber shop where the radiator clanged in winter and the windows stuck in July. We managed, and when we couldn't, my mother stretched every dollar until it behaved. Whatever we had, she taught me to set it down gently, plates without chips, shoes lined up by the door, promises kept, even when no one was watching. Harold Mercer was the exception in our small life, a man who built towers out of dirt lots and still made time to show me how to read a blueprint, how to trace a straight line with the edge of my hand, how to find the load-bearing beam in a mess of walls, and know what mattered most. He didn't talk about feelings much, but he didn't have to. He let me stand beside him at job sites in a hard hat 2 sizes too big and said, "Look." And in the looking, I learned that integrity isn't loud, it's steady. The gap between that steadiness and the rooms where Gerald held court got wider as I got older. Mercer and Sons gleamed with glass and marble, while our family dinners ran on rules you couldn't see, but felt anyway, the kind that kept you quiet when a joke landed sharp, the kind that made you second-guess an accomplishment before the sentence ended. Caleb loved those rooms. He knew which tie impressed which client and how to clap a man's shoulder in a way that said, "brother," without meaning it, and people mistook charm for substance because charm stands closer to the light. I recorded the smaller, quieter victories, permits pushed through on a deadline, a subcontractor paid on time, a safety inspection that came back clean after a hard month, and each one felt like a brick set true, but bricks mean nothing to someone who only reads the plaque. When Harold's heart failed in late autumn, the city felt colder by 10 degrees, and in the weeks that followed I told myself that decency would carry the day because it always had in his presence, because he'd said I understood the bones of the work. The day of the funeral should have ended with casseroles and quiet, but Gerald turned the service into a hallway for decisions. In the attorney's office, the lamps were low, and the books smelled like old leather, and a single sentence, "No will," emptied the room of oxygen. I listened, as if distance could change the shape of words, as if the man at the desk had misread a page, and when he didn't, when Gerald squeezed Caleb's shoulder like he was awarding him a medal, I kept my face still and fixed my eyes on the polished edge of the conference table where my reflection wobbled and then steadied. People offered me soft looks on the way out, the kind that say, "I'm sorry," without taking sides, and outside tires hissed over wet asphalt, while the city kept moving around a story that had stopped for me just for a minute in that room. I tucked my hands into my coat and walked down Beacon toward the river, past brownstones glowing warm in their front windows, past a couple arguing softly under the awning of a corner market. And I tried to hear Harold's voice through the noise of it all, tried to remember how he taught me to trust what could hold weight. By the time I reached my building, the rain had tapered to a mist, and the elevator groaned its familiar way to the second floor. I unlocked the apartment and set the funeral roses on the counter because I couldn't throw them away and I couldn't look at them either. The watch Harold gave me when I finished college lay on the table beside a stack of reports I used to care about, and I thought of the nights we'd sat with our sleeves rolled up over plans smudged with pencil, how he'd say, "Again until a line came clean." I changed into a sweater and folded the black dress over a chair back, and for a while all I did was listen to the old pipes tick as they cooled, and the hallway door sigh open, close open again. The knock when it came sounded careful, almost apologetic, like a neighbor with a package delivered to the wrong door. But when I opened it, my mother stood there without an umbrella, hair damp and hands tight around her handbag, as if it carried something heavier than leather. She stepped inside, and whatever she was about to say seemed to settle in the space between us like dust in a shaft of light. She exhaled, reached into the bag, and pressed an envelope into my palm. Elaine didn't explain right away. She just stood in the doorway of my apartment while the city hummed outside her coat, dripping on the rug. The envelope between us seemed to weigh more than anything either of us could lift. She said only that some truths couldn't stay buried forever, and that this one once opened would change everything. I wanted to ask what she meant, but the words never formed. Her expression told me she'd said all she could for now. Then she was gone, swallowed by the hallway's fading light, leaving me alone with the sound of rain against the windows. I didn't open the envelope that night. It sat on the kitchen table, the wax seal glinting under the lamp, daring me to break it. I walked circles around it, making tea. I never drank turning off lights, only to turn them back on again. Sleep wouldn't come. When the sky finally began to pale, I sat down, slipped a finger under the seal, and pulled the papers free. The first was a letter written in Harold Mercer's strong, deliberate hand. His words steadied the air around me. If I was reading this, it meant he was gone, and it also meant he hadn't trusted Gerald to honor his wishes. He wrote that I was his true heir, not by accident or sentiment, but by right, and that proof of it rested with my mother until I was ready to defend myself. Beneath the letter lay a notarized document, a birth record bearing my name, and a blank line where father should have been. Attached to it was a later amendment signed by Harold himself, acknowledging me legally as his granddaughter and heir. The world seemed to tilt. All the years of Gerald's coldness, his refusal to call me daughter, the quiet resentment that hung in every room, it all fell into place. He wasn't my father at all. I sat there until morning light spilled across the table, thinking of every moment that had felt like rejection, now rewritten with a single revelation. The truth was both terrifying and freeing. Gerald's power over me had always been built on lies, and Harold had seen it coming. Somewhere deep down I felt him beside me again, guiding my hand just as he had when I was a girl tracing blueprints. I folded the letter carefully, slipped it back into the envelope, and locked it in the desk drawer before heading to work. Whatever came next, I knew I couldn't let Gerald discover what I held, not yet. The following Sunday, Gerald called for a family gathering at the estate. He made it sound like tradition, but everyone understood it was about solidifying his new rule. The house glowed the way it always had before a big announcement, crystal-polished chandeliers blazing, the smell of expensive wine filling every corner. I almost didn't go. Yet something told me this was the moment Harold had prepared me for. I tucked the envelope into my bag and drove through steady drizzle, rehearsing the words I might need, but knowing nothing could truly prepare me. When I arrived, the foyer was already crowded. Relatives, board members, and a few longtime associates filled the room, murmuring polite condolences that didn't reach their eyes. Gerald stood near the fireplace in a dark suit, his posture confident, almost theatrical. Caleb leaned casually against the mantel beside him, holding a glass of bourbon like a prop. The moment Gerald saw me, his smile thinned. "Avery," he said, "I wasn't sure you'd join us." I kept my voice even. "You asked for family, didn't you?" He nodded once, then lifted his glass. "We're here to celebrate Caleb's appointment as Vice President of Mercer & Sons, a new era for our family's future." Applause followed, hollow and automatic. Caleb's grin widened. "Guess I'll need to get used to people calling me Sir," he said, and a ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. I watched the faces around me. People who'd seen me grow up inside those halls, now pretending not to notice my silence. The sound of their laughter tightened something in my chest. Harold's voice echoed faintly in memory. "A building's only as strong as the foundation beneath it." I stepped forward. Before we start crowning anyone, I said, my voice carrying farther than I expected, there's something everyone here should hear. Conversations died mid-sentence. Gerald's smile froze in place. This isn't the time, he said quietly. No, it is. I reached into my bag and pulled out the envelope, the seal now broken, but the truth inside whole. You said there was no will, I told him, but you didn't mention what Harold left with me. A murmur spread across the room. What is that? Caleb asked, the smugness slipping just a little. Proof, I answered. I unfolded Harold's letter, the paper shaking only slightly in my hands, and began to read. His words filled the parlor. To my granddaughter, Avery Lane, who has the integrity to protect what I built. If Gerald challenges this, remember my word has always been stronger than his greed. Silence settled like dust. For the first time in my life, Gerald had nothing to say. Caleb's glass clinked against the mantel. You expect anyone to believe that, he said. It's just paper. I met his gaze. It's my grandfather's handwriting witnessed and notarized. Gerald's composure cracked. Enough, he snapped. You're embarrassing yourself. I looked at my mother seated on the edge of the sofa, hands twisting in her lap. When she rose, I saw a resolve in her face I hadn't seen in years. She's telling the truth, Gerald Elaine said, her voice trembling but clear. I kept those papers because Harold asked me to. He didn't trust you, and now everyone knows why. The room erupted into whispers. A few of the older board members exchanged looks, the kind that signaled more than surprise. They signaled doubt. Gerald tried to restore order, insisting it was a forgery, a misunderstanding, but the current had already turned. He looked smaller somehow, his authority thinning with each question that wasn't answered. For the first time I saw him hesitate, and I understood what fear looked like on a man who thought he owned everything he could name. The evening ended in chaos. Guests drifted out in uneasy clusters, murmuring about handwriting experts and family scandals. Caleb avoided my eyes as he escorted a group toward the door. Gerald's jaw stayed clenched, his hand gripping the back of a chair so tightly his knuckles went white. My mother stood beside me, quiet but unshaken. It had to come out, she whispered. I nodded, not trusting my voice. When the last car disappeared down the driveway, I walked out into the cold night air and breathed for the first time all day. Back in my apartment, I sat by the window watching headlights trace the wet street below. The envelope lay open on the table beside me, its contents finally in the light where they belonged. The truth had been spoken, but I knew Gerald too well to believe it was over. He would fight, twist, and threaten until he found a way to make me pay for challenging him. Still, a part of me, small but steady, felt something close to relief. The secret wasn't buried anymore. Sleep didn't come easily. Every sound outside pulled me back to the mansion, the gasp of the guests, my mother's voice breaking the silence, the look on Gerald's face when his control slipped. By dawn, the city was quiet again, and I stood at the kitchen counter holding Harold's letter. The ink was beginning to fade at the edges, but the words were as strong as the man who wrote them. I pressed my thumb against his signature and promised myself that whatever Gerald tried next, I would stand tall. The storm had broken, but it was only the beginning. After that night at the estate, I didn't sleep for 3 days. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the look on Gerald's face, the crack in his confidence when the truth began to surface. The silence that followed the gathering was heavier than anything he could have said. He didn't call or send word through Caleb, but I knew him well enough to understand what the quiet meant. He was thinking, planning, waiting for me to make the next move so he could strike first. At Mercer & Sons, the air shifted almost overnight. The same people who once smiled and greeted me in the hallway now looked away. Conversations died when I entered a room. The board, once warm under Harold's leadership, turned cold under Gerald's rule. I noticed small things disappearing from my office. My nameplate family photographs, even a framed blueprint I'd kept from one of our earliest projects together. When I asked about them, no one answered. It was as if I'd already been erased even while standing there. Each day felt longer than the one before. Caleb walked the floors like a man rehearsing for a throne he hadn't earned. He gave orders with a confidence borrowed from Gerald's approval, but his voice sometimes cracked when he thought no one could hear. At meetings, Gerald spoke over me, brushing aside any input I offered. "Let's keep distractions to a minimum," he said once in front of the entire team. The word hung there until the room went silent. I sat back in my chair, staring at the company's logo, engraved in glass, wondering how many of them remembered the nights I stayed late to keep this place running. That evening, the city lights flickered through the office windows as I packed my things into a cardboard box. I wasn't fired. Gerald didn't need to say the words, but my keycard stopped working the next morning. I stood outside the glass doors holding my coffee, staring at the red light that blinked every time I tried to swipe in. That was how he did it. No confrontation, just quiet elimination. When I called Caleb, his tone was soft but rehearsed. "Avery, maybe it's best to take some time away. Things are complicated right now." I hung up without answering. The apartment felt smaller than ever that night. I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by unopened mail and the faint hum of the refrigerator. The envelope that had changed everything was locked in my desk, its presence almost audible in the silence. I knew Gerald wasn't finished. His kind of power thrived in shadows, and if he couldn't destroy my credibility, he'd try to make me disappear from the company's memory. 3 nights later, a knock startled me out of sleep. I checked the clock. It was nearly midnight. When I opened the door, Elaine stood in the hallway, her coat clinging to her shoulders from the drizzle outside. Her eyes were rimmed red, but she didn't look frightened this time. She looked determined. "He's furious," she said, stepping inside. "He's been on the phone all day. Something about damage control." I poured her tea while she sat at the counter rubbing her hands together for warmth. "He's not just angry," she continued. "He's scared. He knows what that letter means." I nodded, unsure what to say. She reached across the table and took my hand. "Your grandfather trusted you for a reason, Avery. Don't let him erase you again." When she left, I stood by the window long after her car disappeared down the street. The rain had turned to mist curling through the streetlights like smoke. I thought about Harold's last words to me. "They can't take your honor unless you give it away." I wasn't ready to give it away. Not this time. Over the next few days, I started sorting through everything Harold had left behind. Old project files, receipts, memos, anything that could connect the missing will to Gerald's sudden takeover. Each page carried the smell of dust and age, a reminder that truth often hides in plain sight. But the more I searched, the more questions I found. Why had Arthur Pike, our family attorney, declared there was no will when Harold was always meticulous with his records, and how had Gerald gained control so quickly after the funeral? The answers had to be buried somewhere between law offices and filing cabinets. By the following week, I couldn't keep the weight of it to myself anymore. I reached out to a lawyer I'd met years earlier at a business conference, David Foster. He had a reputation for being relentless in uncovering what others wanted to keep hidden. When I called, he remembered me right away. "If this is about Gerald Lane," he said, "I've heard stories. Meet me tomorrow morning at the cafe on Tremont." The next day I arrived early. The cafe smelled like cinnamon and fresh coffee, the kind of place Harold would have liked. David walked in right on time, tall, and composed his briefcase tucked under one arm. I slid the envelope across the table, and he read each page slowly without interruption. When he finished, he exhaled through his nose. "This is strong evidence," he said quietly, "but not enough to win a case yet. If there was a formal will and it disappeared, we'll need proof of tampering records, witnesses, something that ties your guardian directly to the cover-up." My throat tightened. Where do we even start? He tapped the corner of the envelope. "Here. We find out what your grandfather's attorney filed before Gerald showed up. Someone had to handle the documents." The next few weeks blurred into long days and restless nights. David started reaching out to contacts while I combed through storage boxes for anything Harold might have saved. One evening he called to tell me he'd found someone willing to talk, a retired legal secretary named Lydia Hart, who had worked in Arthur Pike's office for nearly 20 years. We met her at a small diner off Route 2. She looked nervous, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of coffee as she spoke. "I remember your grandfather," she said, her voice soft but steady. "He signed a will. I saw it with my own eyes. It was in Mr. Pike's safe. Then after he passed, the will disappeared. When I asked, Mr. Pike said to forget about it. The next day Gerald came in. After that, the safe was empty." Her words made my pulse quicken. David leaned forward. "Would you be willing to testify to that?" She hesitated before nodding. If it helps make things right. Driving home that night, the city lights blurred against the windshield. For the first time since the funeral, the air felt lighter. We had a witness a lead in something Gerald couldn't bury with silence. But when I turned onto my street, my headlights caught a black sedan parked across from my building. Its engine was running windows tinted too dark to see through. I sat there for a moment, my hands frozen on the wheel. When I finally stepped out, the car's headlights flicked on and it pulled away, slowly disappearing around the corner. Inside, I locked the door and found a note slipped under it. 4 words written in rough, heavy ink. Stop, before it's too late. My hands shook as I read it again and again. David's words from earlier echoed in my mind. If Gerald was desperate enough to hide a will, he was desperate enough to silence anyone who could expose him. I sat on the couch with the note in my lap, listening to the refrigerator hum and the faint traffic outside until the fear began to fade into resolve. I packed a small overnight bag and drove to Elaine's house. She didn't ask questions when she opened the door. She just took one look at me and knew. I told her everything, the sedan, the note, Lydia's confession. She stood there for a moment, then nodded toward the guest room. "You'll stay here," she said. "He's not going to win this time." That night, lying awake in the unfamiliar quiet of her home, I held Harold's letter under the bedside lamp and read it again. "You carry my blood, my values, my legacy." The words steadied me. Whatever Gerald was planning, I couldn't let fear undo the truth Harold had trusted me to protect. The warning on that scrap of paper might have been meant to scare me, but it only reminded me that I was getting close. By morning, the sky had turned pale gray over Boston. Elaine brewed coffee while I packed the envelope back into my bag. The silence between us wasn't heavy anymore. It felt like understanding. When I stepped out onto the porch, the air was sharp with the smell of rain. Somewhere in the distance, a bell from the harbor rang through the mist. The storm wasn't over, but for the first time I wasn't facing it alone. The morning after finding that warning note, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The words were burned into my mind, bold and uneven, like they'd been written in anger. I showed it to David during our next meeting, and his expression hardened. "This means you're close," he said. "Gerald knows the walls are closing in." He advised me to stay cautious, avoid being alone after dark, and keep a copy of every document we'd found so far. His voice was calm, but the tension in his jaw said enough. Over the next few days, Boston seemed to shrink around me. I kept seeing the same dark sedan parked across from different places. I visited the grocery store, the post office, even near the cafe where I met David. Maybe it was coincidence, but every time I looked twice, it was gone. Elaine insisted I keep staying with her, and I didn't argue. She left a light on in the hallway at night, the kind of small comfort that shouldn't have mattered, but did. The quiet hum of her house was safer than the silence of my apartment. David spent his days digging deeper. He called in favors from contacts at the clerk's office, trying to trace Harold's original estate filings. I helped however I could, scanning documents, searching through my grandfather's archived blueprints, reading old correspondence that might reveal what Gerald had done. Most nights ended the same way: papers spread across Elaine's kitchen table, 2 cups of coffee gone cold, and a growing pile of notes that looked more like a detective's wall than a family's story. Then late one Thursday evening, David called with news. "I've found the transaction records," he said. 2 large withdrawals from the company's accounts right after Harold's death. They don't match any known expenses. He paused before continuing. "If Gerald used that money to pay someone to destroy the will, we can prove intent. But we'll need bank verification." My pulse quickened. "Can we get it?" "Not without a subpoena," he replied. "Which means court." That single word, court, hung in the air long after the call ended. I knew Gerald would never surrender quietly. But Harold's voice echoed through my mind, steady and certain. "They can't take your honor unless you give it away." I wasn't going to give it away. The following week, David filed a formal petition. The hearing date came faster than I expected. On the morning of the trial, I stood outside the courthouse, the wind sharp against my coat. David met me on the steps, briefcase in hand. "Whatever happens in there," he said, "you tell the truth. Nothing more, nothing less. That's what wins." I nodded, clutching the folder that held every piece of evidence: Harold's letter, the notarized documents, Lydia's testimony, the financial records. Inside the courtroom smelled faintly of varnished wood and dust. Gerald sat at the defendant's table, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, his silver cufflinks catching the light. Caleb sat beside him, looking smaller than usual, his eyes darting between us. Arthur Pike was there too, thin-lipped and pale. For a moment, none of them looked real, just figures I'd known all my life, now strangers across a line drawn in wood and law. When the judge entered the room, went still. She was a composed woman with gray hair pulled back in a low twist, her gaze sharp but patient. "We are here to hear the case regarding the estate of the late Harold Mercer," she announced. "The plaintiff, Avery Lane, asserts that the original will was concealed or destroyed." Her tone was steady, almost clinical, but my heartbeat wasn't. David stood first, his words deliberate and calm. "Your Honor, we intend to prove that Mr. Gerald Lane, aided by attorney Arthur Pike, knowingly concealed Mr. Mercer's will in order to seize control of Mercer & Sons Construction. We will present evidence, witnesses, and financial records that establish a pattern of fraud." The judge nodded. "Proceed." David turned to me. "Avery, please take the stand." The courtroom seemed to tilt as I walked forward. I swore the oath and sat down, gripping the wooden edge of the witness box. The microphone picked up every breath I took. "Ms. Lane, David began, please describe what you found after your grandfather's passing." I unfolded the letter from the folder, the paper trembling slightly in my hand. "This was written by my grandfather, Harold Mercer," I said. "He made it clear that I was his rightful heir. He left these documents with my mother because he didn't trust Gerald to honor his wishes." My voice steadied as I spoke. He believed in fairness and honesty. He wanted what he built to stay in the hands of someone who would protect it. David asked me to identify the notarized acknowledgement of heirship. I held it up for the court to see. "This record names me as Harold's granddaughter by bloodline acknowledgement. Gerald knew about this and tried to bury it." Murmurs rippled through the audience seats. When I glanced at Gerald, his jaw was tight, his expression unreadable. Next, David called Lydia Hart. She looked nervous as she stepped up, clutching her purse like a shield. "I worked for Mr. Pike for 20 years, she began softly. "I saw Harold Mercer sign his will. It was kept in Mr. Pike's office safe. After Mr. Mercer died, I came to work one morning and the safe was empty. Mr. Pike told me to forget about it. That same week, Gerald Lane came to the office." She paused, swallowing hard. "The next day, the file was gone." Gasps spread through the courtroom. The judge leaned forward slightly. "You are certain of what you saw?" Lydia nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I handled the filing myself." Arthur Pike shifted in his seat, adjusting his glasses, but said nothing. Finally, Gerald was called to testify. He rose slowly, buttoning his jacket as he walked to the stand. His voice when he spoke was smooth and practiced. "This is absurd," he said. "Avery is mistaken. My father, Harold, never intended for her to inherit anything. She was impulsive, emotional, unfit to run a business. He trusted me. Something in me snapped. I stood before David could stop me." "Trusted you." The words echoed across the room. "You took everything from him. You hid the truth because you couldn't stand that he saw me for who I was." The judge's gavel struck once, sharp and final. "Ms. Lane, please remain calm," she said. But her eyes softened just slightly as she turned back to Gerald. David approached the bench with the bank records. "Your Honor," he said, "these withdrawals, $50,000 and $30,000, occurred the same week the will disappeared, and threats were made against my client. There is no business justification for these transactions." The judge's expression tightened. "Mr. Lane, how do you explain this?" Gerald's hand twitched on the rail. "Those funds were for private expenses." His voice faltered. He glanced toward Arthur Pike, but the attorney looked away. The silence that followed felt endless. Then from the back of the courtroom, Elaine stood. Her voice carried trembling but strong. "Your Honor, I can confirm what Avery has said. Harold gave me that envelope because he feared Gerald would destroy the will. He wanted Avery to have it when the time was right." The room erupted in whispers. Gerald's composure finally cracked. Margaret? He started using her middle name, a habit from years of control. But she didn't flinch. The judge raised her gavel again. Order. After a long pause, she spoke. Based on the testimony documents and financial evidence, this court finds sufficient cause to open a criminal investigation into Gerald Lane and Arthur Pike for fraud and concealment. Furthermore, the estate of Harold Mercer will remain frozen pending further review. The sound of her gavel struck again. My breath caught somewhere between relief and disbelief. Gerald's shoulders slumped, his face pale beneath the courtroom lights. Two bailiffs stepped closer to his table as the judge adjourned the session. As I turned toward the exit, he leaned forward, his voice low and venomous. You think you've won Avery, but this isn't over. I met his eyes for the last time that day. No, Gerald, I said quietly. For you, it's just begun. Outside, the cold air hit my face like a cleansing wind. David walked beside me down the courthouse steps, saying little. Behind us, the heavy doors closed on years of silence and fear. For the first time, I felt the ground beneath me steady, but deep down I knew this wasn't the end. The investigation would be long, and Gerald would fight until the last piece of his empire was gone. Still, as I looked toward the city skyline, the light seemed brighter than before, like Harold's legacy was still shining through the cracks of everything Gerald had tried to bury. The weeks after the courtroom felt strangely still, like the world had paused just long enough for the truth to breathe. Gerald and Arthur Pike were facing a full criminal investigation, their reputations collapsing faster than I'd ever imagined possible. Newspapers printed cautious headlines using words like alleged and pending review, but people inside the company knew. The whispered conversations in the hallways stopped when I walked past, replaced by the sound of doors closing quietly behind me. For the first time, silence no longer felt like fear, it felt like consequence. David called every few days with updates. The estate would remain frozen until the investigation concluded. But the letter, the notarized record, and the testimony had already shifted the balance. Mercer & Sons was operating under temporary board oversight, and several members had privately urged me to consider stepping in as interim executive. I told David I wanted to wait until the investigation was complete. He understood. You'll know when it's time, he said. You always do. At night, the weight of the past months seemed to lift in pieces. Elaine kept a small light burning in her kitchen, even when she wasn't awake, saying it helped her sleep, knowing someone could always find their way home. I spent most evenings there sorting through company archives and old project files, not for evidence anymore, but for understanding. There were letters between Harold and his first partner's plans for city bridges that still stood strong decades later, notes scribbled in the margins about craftsmanship and honesty. It reminded me why this fight had begun not for control, but for preservation. The investigation dragged into late spring. Gerald's lawyers tried every tactic they could think of, filing motions, disputing signatures, questioning Lydia's credibility, but nothing erased the trail he'd left. Bank records confirmed the withdrawals, and emails between him and Pike revealed their plan to simplify estate execution. The phrasing was clinical, but the intent was unmistakable. Each revelation landed like another crack in the wall he'd built around his image. When the court reconvened for the final ruling on the estate, the weather had shifted. Boston was bright and restless, the kind of day that made it hard to stay angry. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside David, listening as the judge read the findings. Based on submitted evidence and testimony, she said this court recognizes Avery Lane as the rightful heir of the estate of Harold Mercer. The words came out even almost ordinary, but they filled every quiet corner inside me that had been empty since Harold's death. The judge continued assigning financial restitution and ordering a permanent audit of the company's accounts. By the time she struck the gavel, I realized my hands were trembling. Outside, David clasped my shoulder. "It's done," he said. The words sounded both final and unreal. I looked up at the courthouse steps where we'd first walked together months earlier. The same wind cut across the plaza, but it carried something lighter, now relief, maybe, or peace, trying to find its way in. Back at Mercer & Sons, the offices felt different. The air no longer carried Gerald's authority. People spoke freely again. They smiled without looking over their shoulders. I walked the halls I'd once been afraid to enter, past the conference rooms where my voice had been silenced, past the boardroom door where my future had nearly been decided without me. The marble floors still bore faint scuff marks from construction boots Harold used to insist on wearing during inspections. He believed you couldn't run a company from behind glass, you had to walk where the work happened. Standing there, I could almost hear his voice echoing through the atrium. I didn't make an announcement when I returned to the office. I didn't need to. Word spread quietly the way truth often does. My name reappeared on the company directory 2 days later, not under assistant or consultant, but under a single title, President Mercer & Sons Construction. It felt heavy and right all at once. The following week, I met with the board to discuss rebuilding not just contracts or profit margins, but culture, what Harold had meant by honor. I told them this wouldn't be about legacy worship or revenge. It would be about doing the work the way it was meant to be done. A few days later, I returned home to find an unfamiliar car parked at the curb. Caleb was sitting on the front steps, his shoulders hunched, a paper coffee cup balanced between his hands. I hesitated before walking closer. He stood when he saw me looking older than his 33 years. "I wanted to talk," he said quietly, "if that's okay." I nodded, and we sat on the porch watching the late afternoon light stretch across the street. "I was wrong," he said after a while. "Dad made me believe I deserved everything. I see now he was using me. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to make things right." His voice cracked on the last word. I studied him for a long moment. The arrogance that used to define him was gone, replaced by something almost fragile. "If you mean that I said, then, you'll start at the bottom. No shortcuts, no titles. You'll earn your place the way everyone else does." He nodded without hesitation. "I understand." We sat in silence for a few more minutes, listening to the city hum around us. When he left, the air felt lighter, as if the weight of resentment had finally begun to shift. I didn't know if he would keep his word, but for the first time, I believed he might try. That evening, I walked through the lobby of Mercer & Sons long after the staff had gone home. The building was quiet, except for the faint hum of the air vents and the rhythmic click of my heels on the tile. Harold's portrait hung at the far end of the corridor, a black and white photograph of him in a hard hat, smiling faintly beneath the brim. I stopped in front of it and traced the engraved plaque with my finger. The words were simple, built on honor. I stood there for a long time, the hum of the city just beyond the glass. The empire he'd built had nearly been lost to greed, but now it was mine to guard, not as a trophy, but as a responsibility. Elaine called later that night to ask how it went. When I told her, she didn't say much, just whispered, "He'd be proud of you, Avery." The line stayed quiet for a moment, both of us thinking of the man who had started it all. As I looked out over the Boston skyline from my office window, the lights shimmered against the dark river. Everything felt different, familiar, but changed. The company was no longer a monument to control. It was a homecoming. I thought of the years spent in silence, the nights filled with fear, and how a single letter had brought the truth back into the light. Down on the street, the traffic moved steadily, people going home from their own long days. For the first time, I didn't feel the ache of fighting anymore. I felt ready for what came next. The battle was over, but the rebuilding had just begun, and in that quiet moment, I knew exactly where I needed to start. The city moved at its usual pace again, but for me, time still felt slower, quieter. After the final judgment, the air around everything seemed different, lighter somehow, though the noise of Boston never truly stopped. Gerald's name had disappeared from the company's letterhead and from every door plate that once bore his authority. News reports called it a fall from grace, but to those who'd worked under him, it was a relief that came far too late. Arthur Pike's law license was suspended within weeks, and his office closed. Gerald kept silent through most of the proceedings, though I heard he'd moved to a smaller property north of the city out of sight. His silence felt less like dignity and more like a wall built to keep out shame. Elaine didn't ask about him, and I didn't bring it up. Some chapters needed to stay closed. At Mercer & Sons, I spent my mornings walking the floors Harold used to inspect. The hum of machinery and the faint smell of sawdust reminded me of when I was young, when I'd follow him through half-finished hallways and listen to the rhythm of his steps. He used to say you could tell the soul of a building by how it sounded under your feet. Now every echo felt like a conversation we'd never finished. The first months were consumed by repair, legal, financial, and emotional. I met with every department head one by one, listening more than I spoke. Many of them admitted they'd stayed out of Gerald's way for fear of losing their jobs. I didn't blame them. Instead, I told them the same thing Harold told me when I first joined: we build trust before we build walls. It became a quiet mantra that began to spread through the office, slowly mending what fear had broken. Caleb kept his word. He started as an entry-level project coordinator, trading conference calls for site visits and long hours under the sun. I didn't make it easy for him, but I didn't have to. The work did that on its own. He showed up early, stayed late, and didn't complain when crews treated him like anyone else. One afternoon, I stopped by a downtown site to review progress, and I saw him lifting beams alongside the crew, sweat darkening his shirt. He caught sight of me, nodded once, then went back to work. That small gesture spoke louder than any apology. Elaine visited the office more often now, bringing lunch or a batch of her homemade rolls for the staff. People adored her calm energy, and for the first time she seemed to move through a room without shrinking. One afternoon, she found me in Harold's old office, reorganizing the shelves that still smelled faintly of cedar. She leaned in the doorway, smiling. "He'd say you finally stopped hiding behind modesty," she teased. I laughed, though part of me still wasn't sure I'd earned the right to fill his chair. In late summer, David came by with a stack of finalized documents. The estate audit was complete, and all remaining assets had been transferred to my name. "It's official," he said, handing me the folder. "Mercer & Sons is yours, clean, legitimate, and whole again." I looked at the embossed seal on the papers, the weight of it settling in like the sound of a door closing after a storm. "You can rest now," he added, smiling. "But knowing you probably won't." He wasn't wrong. Rest didn't come easily. Nights were long, filled with plans and possibilities, ideas for new community projects, mentorship programs, rebuilding partnerships that Gerald had severed. I wanted to honor Harold's vision by expanding it, not just preserving it. I started visiting vocational schools across the state, speaking with students who reminded me of the ambition I once had but wasn't allowed to show. We began sponsoring scholarships for apprentices in construction and design, giving opportunities to those who'd never had them. Each success felt like a small brick laid in the foundation of something Harold would have recognized. Then one evening in early autumn, a letter arrived addressed in Caleb's handwriting. He'd been working on a special project in one of the company's older divisions and wanted me to see it in person. When I arrived at the site, the sun was setting over the harbor, painting everything in gold. He led me to a newly restored workshop, the kind Harold used in the early days. The walls were lined with framed photographs, black and white images of cruise blueprints and city skylines. In the center stood a bronze plaque, "The Mercer Initiative Built on Honor." Caleb looked nervous as I read the inscription. "It's a foundation," he said, "for kids coming out of trade school who can't afford their first tools or certifications. I used my salary to start it, but I want the company to take it over." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The boy who once laughed at my dedication to Harold's ideals was now building his own way back to them. I nodded. "He'd be proud of you," I said quietly. Caleb's eyes glistened, but he just smiled and said, "We both know he was stubborn. Maybe it runs in the family." As autumn deepened, life began to settle into something like peace. Gerald's trial was scheduled for early winter, and though I wouldn't have to testify again, David kept me informed. The charges of fraud and concealment would likely carry prison time. I thought about attending, then decided against it. Some victories didn't need an audience. Instead, I visited the old Mercer property outside the city, a place I hadn't seen since Harold's passing. The house stood quiet under the shade of oak trees, its shutters weathered but strong. I walked through the overgrown garden to the small workshop behind the house. Dust floated in the sunbeams like suspended time. On the workbench lay Harold's old drafting tools, rusted now but still perfectly arranged. I found a notebook tucked inside a drawer, pages filled with half-finished sketches and quotes in his handwriting. On the final page in faded ink, he'd written, Integrity doesn't end with a person. It continues in the choices others make after them. I sat there for a long time, tracing those words with my finger. Outside, the air smelled like sawdust and fallen leaves. It struck me that Harold had never truly been gone. His lessons had simply been waiting for someone to listen again. When I locked the door behind me, the sun had dipped below the trees, and the air carried that first hint of winter. I drove back to the city with the window cracked open, the cold wind clearing the quiet from my mind. Mercer & Sons glowed in the distance as I crossed the bridge, its logo, now a reminder not of wealth or inheritance, but of survival built on truth. At home, Elaine was waiting with 2 mugs of tea. We sat on the couch, the kind of quiet that only comes after years of noise filling the space between us. "What now?" she asked softly. I thought for a moment before answering. "Now," I said, "we build." Outside, the city lights flickered across the glass, and for the first time in years, I felt no trace of fear. The story that had begun with silence had found its voice again, steady and sure. The fight was finally behind us, but the life we'd been meant to live was just beginning. Winter arrived early that year, settling over Boston in a hush that made the city lights look softer against the snow. Mercer & Sons moved at a steady rhythm again, the sound of progress replacing the tension that once filled its halls. I spent most mornings at the office before dawn, watching the skyline blush pink through the frosted windows. It was a season of rebuilding contracts, renewed partnerships, repaired, and quiet pride slowly returning to the people who had kept this company alive, despite everything. Caleb had adjusted better than I expected. He worked under the supervision of one of our senior foremen, never asking for special treatment, never cutting corners. I'd pass by a construction site now and then and see him covered in dust, shouting directions through the hum of machines. He had found a rhythm in the work that discipline could only teach. Elaine would stop by with thermoses of coffee and sandwiches, claiming it was for the crew, though I noticed she always brought an extra for him. The 3 of us rarely talked about the past anymore. It wasn't denial, it was peace. The trial for Gerald and Arthur Pike began in January. David handled most of it, insisting I stay focused on the company. Still, I followed every update. The charges had narrowed to fraud, document concealment, and obstruction. The evidence was overwhelming: forged filings, bank transfers, witness statements. The man who once controlled every corner of my life now stood exposed before the same law he thought he could bend. Elaine wanted to attend the sentencing, but I hesitated. In the end, we went together. The courtroom looked smaller than I remembered, the same pale walls, but stripped of the weight they once carried. Gerald sat at the defense table, his hands folded, eyes fixed on the floor. Arthur Pike sat beside him, his face drawn and tired. When the judge read the verdict guilty on all counts, Gerald didn't move. Not when the sentence was announced, not even when the bailiff stepped forward. For the first time in my life, he looked small. As the courtroom emptied, he lifted his head and found my eyes. There was no hatred there, only exhaustion. I waited for anger to rise, but it didn't. What I felt instead was the quiet certainty that the story between us was finally over. Elaine's hand tightened around mine. "Let's go home," she whispered. That night, snow drifted across the city in thick, slow waves. From my apartment window, the world looked softer, blanketed in white, like it was trying to start fresh. I sat by the fire reading through the company's new scholarship proposals pages, filled with hopeful essays from students who wanted to build something lasting. Harold would have loved it. He'd always said that legacies weren't measured by buildings, but by the people who built them. A week later, Caleb came into my office holding a small box wrapped in brown paper. "Mom said you should open this one yourself," he said, setting it down on my desk. I peeled away the wrapping and found Harold's old pocket watch, the one I thought I'd lost years ago during a company move. Its surface was scratched and worn, but it still ticked steadily when I turned the crown. Inside, etched in fading letters, were 3 words: honor over pride. I closed my hand around it, feeling the metal warm against my palm. In the following months, the company's rhythm became my own. We secured new contracts, expanded training programs, and launched the Mercer initiative Caleb had started. At our first foundation dinner, the room filled with apprentices, engineers, and their families. I watched Caleb step up to the podium, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke about second chances and integrity. His voice caught when he thanked me and Elaine, but he steadied himself and finished strong. The applause that followed wasn't polite, it was heartfelt. After the dinner, Elaine joined me outside under the string lights that lined the patio. The air was cold enough to see our breath. "You've given them back their future," she said quietly. I shook my head. We all did. She smiled, brushing a snowflake from my coat. "Harold would say you finally learned how to stand taller than your fear." Spring came early, melting the last traces of snow from the rooftops. By then, the investigation into Gerald's assets had concluded. Everything he'd once owned, his house, his accounts, even his art collection, was liquidated to pay restitution. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who'd built his life around control lost everything by trying to keep it. I never saw him again. David later told me he'd requested no contact with the family. I agreed. Some peace was better kept at a distance. At work, change came quietly. The walls were repainted, the company logo restored to Harold's original design, and a new motto engraved beneath it, "Integrity builds forever." I stood in the lobby watching the crew finish the last letter and felt a stillness settle inside me. It wasn't triumph, it was closure. That evening, Caleb stopped by my office. "Mom's making dinner," he said. "She wants you to come early. Something about a surprise." I laughed. "She's terrible at keeping secrets." He grinned. "You didn't hear it from me, but there might be pie involved." Elaine's house smelled like cinnamon and rosemary when I arrived. She'd set the table with Harold's old dishes, the ones she'd been too afraid to use for years. Halfway through dinner, she reached under the table and pulled out a folded newspaper. On the front page was a feature about Mercer & Sons' community program, A Legacy Rebuilt on Honor. My picture wasn't large, but the headline said everything that needed to be said. Elaine's eyes shimmered as she looked across the table. "You did it," she said. I shook my head. "We did." Caleb raised his glass. "To the man who started it," he said softly, "and to the woman who finally made it right." We clinked glasses, and for a moment the world felt perfectly balanced, like every broken piece had found its place again. Later that night, I stood alone on Elaine's porch as a cool wind moved through the trees. The stars were faint but steady, and somewhere in the distance a church bell chimed the hour. I reached into my coat pocket and felt the weight of Harold's watch ticking against my hand like a heartbeat. The noise of the past was gone now, replaced by something quieter and more enduring. The kind of silence Harold would have called peace. Inside, Elaine's laughter carried down the hallway, soft and full of life. I turned toward the light spilling from the doorway and thought about how far we had all come from fear to truth, from survival to meaning. For the first time, I understood what Harold meant when he said, "Honor wasn't inherited, it was chosen again and again." As I stepped inside, the warmth of home wrapped around me, and I realized that even after everything we'd lost, we had built something stronger in its place. The story that began with a broken promise was ending with a legacy restored and a life finally reclaimed. The spring that followed was unlike any I'd ever known. The city was bright again, the kind of bright that made everything feel possible. Mercer & Sons had not only recovered, it was thriving. New apprentices filled the training halls Harold once dreamed of building, and each morning the hum of work echoed across the courtyard like music. Sometimes I'd pause at the entrance just to listen. It was the sound of a legacy breathing again. Caleb was still on site most days, covered in sawdust and sunburn, laughing with the same men who once doubted him. Elaine had started volunteering with the Foundation's mentorship program, helping young families learn the kind of financial stability she never had when Gerald controlled her world. I saw her smile more often now, a quiet, genuine kind of joy that didn't need permission to exist. The day we unveiled the new Mercer Memorial Wing, the air carried that soft warmth that comes only after winter has finally loosened its grip. The building stood tall and modern, its glass walls reflecting the sky. Inside, we dedicated a small gallery to Harold's life, his handwritten notes, photographs from his early projects, and a bronze plaque with his favorite quote, "Integrity builds forever." During the ceremony, I said a few words. My hands didn't shake this time. I talked about the kind of man Harold was, how he believed work was sacred when done with purpose, and how honor wasn't measured in money, but in how you treated people when no one was watching. When I stepped down, I caught sight of Caleb standing in the back with a hand over his heart, and Elaine beside him, tears glinting under the light. That evening, after the crowd had gone, I stayed behind in the quiet lobby. The floors gleamed and the city lights shimmered through the windows. For a moment, I could almost hear Harold's voice beside me, steady and patient, reminding me that storms don't destroy what's real, they reveal it. Everything that had once been used to break me had become the foundation I now stood on. David called a few days later to tell me the final papers on Gerald's sentencing were complete. He'd accepted his punishment without appeal. "It's all behind you now," David said. I thanked him, knowing it wasn't just about the case. It was about the peace that comes when you stop letting anger write your story. I didn't hate Gerald anymore. The weight of him had fallen away with the truth, and that was enough. On Sundays, Elaine and I often visited Harold's old house outside the city. We cleaned up the garden, pruned the overgrown vines, and left fresh tulips by the door. Caleb joined us sometimes, bringing a small notebook of sketches for the next community project, a housing development for single parents built on land Harold once owned. Watching him describe it with that same spark Harold used to have reminded me that change, real change, was possible. One afternoon, I walked into Harold's old workshop, the one I'd restored after the trial. Dust floated in the light coming through the small window, and on the workbench lay the same set of tools he'd used for decades. I picked up his hammer, heavy, worn smooth by time, and smiled. For years, I thought inheritance meant money or ownership, but it wasn't that. It was the courage to keep building when everything around you has fallen apart. The world had tested me, but it had also shown me what I was made of. I learned that justice isn't just a verdict. It's the quiet decision to keep standing tall long after the noise has faded. It's choosing truth, even when it costs you comfort and compassion, even when it's undeserved. Harold's lessons had lived long enough to become my own. As spring gave way to summer, the company's new sign was installed above the main entrance, Mercer & Sons, a family built on honor. Beneath it, I added one small line in Harold's handwriting, taken from one of his old notebooks: "May every foundation you lay be stronger than the one before." The evening before the building officially opened, I stood outside with Elaine and Caleb, watching the sun sink behind the cranes and rooftops. The lights in the offices came on one by one, glowing like a promise kept. Elaine slipped her arm through mine. "You've done more than rebuild a company," she said. "You rebuilt us." Her words lingered as the first stars appeared above the city. For a long time, I'd thought justice meant restoring what was lost, but I understood now it was about creating something new where pain once lived. The house we stood in front of the family we'd become the legacy Harold left. All of it had been rebuilt on truth. When I finally went home that night, I placed Harold's pocket watch on my desk. Its steady ticking filled the quiet room, marking time not as something to chase, but something to honor. The fight was over, but the life that followed felt like the real reward. If you've ever had to start over or stand up for what's right even when it costs you everything, then you already know it's not about revenge. It's about reclaiming peace. And if this story found you tonight, maybe it's a reminder that it's never too late to build again. Take care of your heart and of the truth that lives inside it. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, stay a while. There's always another chapter waiting to be told.